Greetings, everyone. This is Andy Revkin. I am the founding director of the Earth Institute Initiative on Communication and Sustainability. And one of the questions is, how do you sustain the capacity to communicate important issues when they're erupting, when they're full of uncertainty and certainty, when they're spreading in ways that are novel, meaning we don't understand everything about this virus remotely. There's lots of context we can understand from past epidemics, but this is the first real high consequence pandemic in generations. And there's no one better suited to feature in a conversation today that's oriented significantly toward journalists around the world grappling with this, coming here to interact with Laurie Garrett, but also students and the public generally. This is a conversation that's open. I'd like to have these sessions be as open as possible to the world. And there's many time zones. Some people will be catching up with this. Some journalists have already sent in questions from Botswana and Bangladesh. And we're going to hear from students, including those of Alex Jetter, who's at Dartmouth.
Alexis, actually, yeah.
Sorry?
Alexis
Jetter, yeah. But Laurie, you have the floor first. I want to just, if anyone on this this beat or anyone tuned into this situation we're in the world right now does not know Laurie Garrett, now is the moment to get familiar with her work. Laurie has been at this for decades, since before the HIV epidemic spread. She's been on the beat. She started way back when in newspapers, and she's been featured. She was at the Council on Foreign Relations for a long time as an analyst and expert on this issue, along with a masterful writer. And Laurie, I wanted to just start with asking you, how are you doing? Right, and you're allowed to take a breath.
At various moments, I fear my head is going to explode. The pressure is amazing. You can probably see the redness in my eyes. I've been working pretty much 24/7 since before Christmas, when I first realized that this virus was spreading in Wuhan, and began to be suspicious that at that time I thought it was SARS. And having been in the SARS epidemic in China and Hong Kong in 2003, and put a lot of work into going back to countries that were hard hit by SARS, Vietnam, Thailand, Singapore, and so on, to see how they responded, what they learned from it. I knew that we dodged a bullet in 2003, that SARS could have been much worse. And it was extremely lethal, very, very lethal. So I was really concerned starting in December, and I've been feeling like, I mean, every night I go to bed feeling like, oh my God, there's this list of things I didn't do today. Why? I worked all day, 18 hours nonstop. I took one break to eat lunch, and I feel like I'm still underwater. I haven't caught up. And every single night I go to sleep wondering, did I get a fact wrong? Did I tweet something that wasn't exactly right? Did I misstate or misunderstand this research paper? Do I believe this scientist? Do I believe their analysis? And it's just, the pressure is just overwhelming. And then you add to it, nobody's paying for any of it.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody wants expertise for free. Nobody wants to pay you for any of it. And if you think, I have to say, the tweet that has, of all the tweeted things, and I do get like death threats and horrible things sent to me, but of all the things said, the one that has most upset me and twice caused me to wake up in the middle of the night screaming in my sleep, is an email that, or a tweet that was posted back in January by a very prominent science editor, who said, basically, to paraphrase him, well, Laurie Garrett must be thrilled because finally she's proven to be correct about something. Now there'll be a great epidemic and she'll get rich off of it.
Jesus.
And I was so upset. And I posted back, I tweet responded saying, how dare you say such a thing? What a vile, disgusting horrible thing to imply that, one, I want to get rich off of the pain and suffering of millions of people, and two, that I was always wrong and now suddenly I'm right. And of course, he never apologized. And I eventually blocked him because, thanks to him, thousands of trolls descended and started attacking me for all sorts of things that, have nothing to do with the issue, that I'm fat, that I'm old, that I'm ugly, that I'm a woman, that I'm a liar, that I'm a racist, that I'm this and that. And you go down the list and it's like, why do I even bother to get up in the morning? There is no thank you for this work, I'll tell you. And any student out there that's watching this, any young aspiring journalist needs to know, when you're hitting a nerve, you take the shit, right? It comes at you. And you're hitting a nerve and you're hitting it right when the attacks start getting harder and harder and harder. And the strength that's required to get through it day by day is pretty real. Well, so that's how I'm feeling, Andy.
Yeah. Well, and partially I wanted this to be for you to help transfer some of the knowledge and emotional strength you've had to develop on this beat for decades, knowing that this issue is profound, knowing, as you said, that you were not wrong. It's not like you're wrong and now you're right. The systems that we have built in a heartbeat of global history are super vulnerable to disruption in ways that we've only just begun to appreciate, and too often in retrospect, as right now.
Andy, I remember when you were at the New York Times writing about climate change, you were really at the pioneer front end of that as a beat. And it was in a time when the deniers always had to get equal play in every darn story. So here's 9,000 scientists over here, and here's this one bozo here. And for the sake of balance, you had to interview the one bozo. But you were a Cassandra on the climate front, and you took the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune for years. And it's been very similar on the emerging diseases front. I brought some show and tell here because, the books, just to give you an idea, I don't write short books. And, about a third of this book is data and references in fine print to try and show people, how did I know this? Who said this? Where did this come from?
Right.
On everything I said. So that's 1994. And then people attacked me saying, well, okay, even if we believe you that there will be epidemics, that emerging diseases are able to come forward partly because of what we're doing to the environment, partly because of the devastation we're doing to planet Earth, that's facilitating the movement of microbes in ways that were never possible before. So, okay, maybe we believe you, but what's the answer? What's the solution? Or do we just roll over and die? So then I traveled all over the world for this book, also a short, little quickie. And for this book, I went all over the former Soviet Union for almost a year. I traveled all over the United States, all over India, all over sub-Saharan Africa, and looked at the status of global health systems. What was going on? Were there systems in place in public health that could actually save lives? Or were the systems so weakened, so undervalued, and so demolished by politicians that they weren't going to be capable of meeting the challenge? So this came out in 2000. The answer, of course, was the systems are weak and they're not meeting the challenge. So that's 2000. Barely was the ink dry on that book. And then 9/11 happened. And so I put another modest amount of work into documenting what happened with 9/11 and the anthrax attacks. And, my whole premise with this book was that none of the preparedness I was describing here had gone into place. So when anthrax happened, and when the health effects of the destruction of the World Trade Center, which is right outside my window here, and I was there, when those events transpired, the world did not have preparedness to even know, how dangerous is an anthrax spore? How many spores equals a human dose that can be toxic and can kill you? How do you clean anthrax out of the Senate office building? How do you ensure that the chemicals coming off the burning World Trade Center for 4 months are safe for human beings to breathe? Who are the cleanup crews sent in, and what were they told about asbestos? What's happened to them? How many died of cancer? How do you explain the phenomenal increase in cancer deaths among firefighters and police officers who responded to the 9/11 attacks? There's no other way to explain it except that was lethal, that those fumes, those gases were lethal. But we didn't have anything in place. And then I was also involved in this book, which looked at how and why those attacks happened, and why weren't all our warnings about bioterrorism and the multiple uses and reuses of basic science research, why were they ignored? Why didn't anybody take it seriously? It's not like we hadn't already written and talked about anthrax many times. And yet it was always treated by the intel community as if nobody will ever do that. That's just craziness. And the standard answer was, why would somebody use a biological agent? Why? They'd get themselves sick. They couldn't control the microbe. It might sicken the good guys and the bad guys from their point of view, right? Well, guess what? Terrorists don't think like that. They're ready to go to God. They're ready to die. It doesn't matter. So it was a false idea. And then one of the people involved who'd been warning about 9/11 was Richard Clarke, who was the national security advisor, saying Al-Qaeda is about to attack. He was warning about it. He was saying it's coming. They're going to get us. We have to be ready. And he was ignored, of course. And he's now become very famous for his role. Well, he and R.P. Eddy, who worked with Richard Holbrooke and now runs a private sort of a national security analysis company for Wall Streeters, wrote this book, Finding Cassandras to Stop Catastrophes. And I'm profiled in this book as one of several. And one of the things I got out of reading this book was to understand that so much of what I've been through since I started working on this issue way back in the late 80s, or actually, no, late 70s, right. Missed a decade. So much of what I've gone through is mirrored by everybody who plays the role of someone standing out and warning, hey, look over there behind the curtain. There's a guy pulling those levers. We got to pay attention, and we got to pull that curtain back. It's very hard. It's been very hard.
So hold on. Let me just go to this other format. And here we are. And by the way, the Cassandra history mythology gets misconstrued sometimes. Cassandra was right. I think a lot of people think of the Cassandra. She's just a Cassandra as being someone who's just waving their hands.
Pollyanna, who was wrong.
Right. Let's
Cassandra, who was right.
That's a good Twitter-friendly thought right there. Pollyanna and Cassandra. So a lot of the folks who've tuned in here are journalists in developing countries and through the Earth Journalism Network, who's helped to facilitate building the presence of this podcast, this webcast today. And they have some questions for you. As we know, in a weird way, and just my son actually in LA made this comment to me a couple of days ago. He said, well, basically the rich world spread this thing first, through transport and global connectedness. And now it's emerging as this profound threat in the poor countries and poor places. Just a few days ago, if you Google or search on Twitter for the word privilege and social distancing, the social distancing we're practicing right now, here we are sitting in our homes, insulated, is not possible in New Delhi or in Lusaka or in other parts of the world. So that's where this is now, this wave, this microbial tsunami is heading there. So given what you've learned, given even the challenges, of getting the message across, what would you say to a journalist in a developing country right now who's not had that experience? Like maybe 2 or 3 tips, actionable ideas for how to find information, how to convey it in ways that people can connect with.
One of the most profound and distressing events in this pandemic occurred just a couple of days ago. Prime Minister Modi in India announced that the pandemic had arrived in India. He had no data to present. He didn't say how many people are infected in India because they're not doing widespread testing and they don't really know. But he said because of this, 1.3 billion people in India are now going to be on lockdown. And they must be under stay-at-home orders. And look what happened. Between the day of that announcement, March 24, and today, millions and millions of poor Indians flooded into bus stations, train stations, or just walked because they couldn't afford the bus or the train to exit the big cities and pour out into the countryside to their home villages, escaping lockdown in the cities. Many of them had no home to be locked down into in the cities. They were accustomed to living in very dire circumstances, sending money home to their home villages. And when you look at the conditions, go on YouTube, take a look. I mean, this lockdown order undoubtedly created a massive spread of COVID because people were crowded into these packed situations, as you're seeing here in this Twitter. There are many such you could see like this. People literally just squeezed against each other and police beating them and knocking them back into even denser crowd situations as they tried to escape India. This undoubtedly spread COVID and has made it a national phenomenon in India. It may have been isolated in a few cases here and there in Mumbai and Delhi. It's now national. It's now everywhere. And if I were a reporter in India today, I would say, there are a slew of stories to pursue immediately. One of them is start tracking some of these people. Right. Go to their villages. Find out what's going on. Do they have any access to healthcare? Is anybody showing up to test anybody? Are there any unusual pneumonias? Is anybody coughing their brains out? Is anybody even looking? Where is government? And I think that overall, the role of the reporter in a pandemic like this, whether you're focused on your own town and your own city, local government, or you're focused on the global picture, you are about accountability. That's your job. Your job is to go out and ask, okay, politician X, Mr. President, Mr. Mayor, Ms. City Councilwoman, whatever status that individual has, you promised X. And I went out and looked, and it's not there. It's not happening. And instead, this is happening, and lives are on the line. Where are you? Why haven't you kept your promises? Why aren't you doing the things you promised to do? And, the urgency is so tremendous. One false promise about delivering masks to nurses or test kits to doctors or protective gear to police officers. One false promise is lives lost now, immediately. It's not some abstract, this is a bad budget claim. This is real. It's this moment. The other day, we had a bright sunny day, as we do today in New York, after many days of gloomy darkness and cold. And I went outside to get some milk and saw the streets were full of people. And they were all young people who'd somehow gotten the message that this is only dangerous for old people.
Yeah.
That the misinformation that's come out is just incredible. And a lot of politicians are the major vehicles of this misinformation. So they've somehow gotten the word that young people can't get sick, young people can't die, they won't be hospitalized, it's really not a problem. It's only old people like me that can get sick and die. So what the heck? I'll go ahead and go out and wander around and go jogging and hang out in the park with my friends for a picnic. And if I get infected, it's no biggie. Well, it is a biggie because you can infect others. You can pass your virus on. You perpetuate the epidemic. And yes, you can get sick. 40% of the seriously ill hospitalized people in New York City right now, which is the epicenter of the entire global pandemic at this moment, 40% of them are under 50 years of age. So this notion that it's just old people, dead wrong. And so the consequences of any statement by any leader that isn't rooted in solid science Or if the solid science is uncertain, doesn't state the uncertainty, is socially irresponsible, is costing lives, is actually killing people.
And here's this question that's come up several times, which is, what the social media context here. Here's Michael Strauss says, I'm seeing a huge upsurge in posts by folks dismissing CV19 reports as being a manipulation by mainstream media on behalf of the deep state. This whole issue that's in the US, but it's also elsewhere. Ebola, you remember you covered Ebola heavily, and the World Health Organization and the Red Cross had set up apps to try to keep up with what the World Health Organization has been calling an infodemic along with the pandemic. Do you have your sense of how to navigate there? You've been very active on social media as well. And by the way, in a second, it'd be fun to get some initial input from Alexis as well.
So let me back up and say this. I've been in more than 30 epidemics in my career, and on every continent except Antarctica. And I would say every single epidemic has shown exactly the same pattern of social and political response. And this is not deviating from that pattern at all. So what's the pattern? First, it's a handful of cases. Oh, it's only 5 cases. Oh, it's only 10 cases. Every epidemic starts with 1, right? They don't just spontaneously become 10,000 cases, but it's always common to see skepticism in media and skepticism on the part of politicians, denying and underplaying the importance of an outbreak when it starts. Then, as powers that be realize they have a real problem on their hands, there's a tendency to cover up. Not so much, some countries do cover up as a matter of actual political party policy or government policy, as I believe was the case in China in the first week of January this year in Wuhan. But in many cases, it's simply, I don't want people to see my incompetence. I don't want people to know that I goofed. So let's downplay this part and that part, and let's blame over here and, what have you. Then as that fails, typically whatever first-line politicians were responsible kind of gets shoved to the side, and some higher up steps into the picture, says, okay, now we're going to fix all this. Now there's going to be a really good response, vigorous, I'm coming in aggressively, I'm taking over, here we go. And that's when you get repression of the press, you get social media being attacked, you start to see a backlash response against the mainstream media coming from counter media forces to either say you're making up the whole phenomenon, or you're blaming the wrong forces, the wrong people, the wrong something. And that's when also bigotry comes into the picture. So, I cut my teeth on the AIDS epidemic starting in 1980 before it had a name. And I was based in San Francisco seeing people dropping dead in their 20s. And right away, you saw a sense of, okay, there's an epidemic, we finally admit it, but it's only them. Who cares about them? Fill in the them. Gay men, IV drug users, sex workers, whatever box you want to put in, women. I loved when toxic shock syndrome happened, and it turned out to be directly caused by a certain kind of tampon product. And the attitude was, well, only women use them. Well, we're 51% of the population, excuse me. So that then you get the targeting and the blame. Then you get to the next stage of the response, which is a mobilization that starts to be commensurate with the level of threat. And it starts to involve multiple channels of government, lots of money, possibly police forces, possibly military forces. And if it's in a developing country, it involves a lot of crying out to WHO, World Bank, please help us. And
Right.
UNICEF and Médecins Sans Frontières and the Red Cross and all the NGO community pours in. And you begin to see a slowly evolving international response. What we have never seen, in modern time, other than with HIV, is a response necessary in every country on earth at once. And we blew it with HIV. We blew it completely. Yeah. Every single country made the same pattern of mistakes. The only countries that didn't were in Scandinavia. Otherwise, the whole world responded to HIV by attacking the humans that were its target rather than the virus, and by restricting and demeaning the people who were at risk. And then escalated to the point where it was, well, we can save the rich world. We have drugs. The poor world can just, until there was a huge activist movement and the spark of imagination from Nelson Mandela from South Africa to push the international community to devise this novel mechanism for making HIV drugs available affordably for the whole world. And today we have an enormous 35, 40 million people alive infected with HIV, but living long and relatively healthy lives because of those drugs. So HIV is both the great harbinger of all failures and the success story at the end of the line that says, it is possible to have global solidarity. It is possible for the world to work together to confront an epidemic disease. Now the question is, can those lessons get translated to this, which is a high-speed epidemic, unlike HIV? It took 10 years to go through the course from infection to AIDS and death. With HIV, that course can be transpired in 10 days with COVID-19.
And this, the pervasiveness of it as well is just, it's literally in every community. And that delay between infection and symptoms creates a kind of a perfect storm aspect as well.
I think what we have to constantly remind ourselves, what was the situation in the world before we realized there was this virus? And the situation in the world was that almost every globalization institution was falling apart, that we'd had a backlash post-2008 financial crisis away from the United Nations system, away from a whole set of globalized networks to deal with disease and health and climate change and a whole variety of issues. And we'd seen the whole world push towards nationalism, patriotism, populism, me-firstism for their countries. And post-2008, we saw a wealth gap that was already very bad suddenly go, so that the top 1% of the planet was controlling more than half of all the wealth on the planet. And the top 5% was controlling more than 80% of global wealth and not distributing downwards in any way that could result in supporting health systems for the poor, pandemic preparedness, or any of the issues that we've been talking about. So that's all before this virus appears. Now the virus appears, and the two biggest nations on earth are China and the United States. And if you're a reporter on this beat, you have to know the politics. You have to know global macroeconomics. You have to know health microeconomics. You have to understand the virology. You have to understand epidemiology. You have to understand mathematical modeling systems. And I could go on and on down a long list so that you're able to understand why in 2020, in the age of genomic analysis, of high throughput research in medicine, with this massive National Institutes of Health and analogous programs elsewhere in the world, why are we caught with our pants down, unable to deal with this in the rich world, and utterly, utterly without concern about what's going to happen as it spreads in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, India, the Philippines, and the Pacific Islands.
There's a question that came in from Lisbon, Portugal, that I want to feature here on the screen. A member of the Earth Journalism Network, Bruno Horta from Lisbon, says, how can reporters avoid the official version where the facts, data, and logistics are controlled by the status quo? I mean, this came up a couple of times already in what you were saying. Is there a way to present information in a compact way that resonates, that doesn't avoid just framing the facts the way a political leader would like them to be framed?
Right, a real challenge. A couple of things I would say about this. It's a really vital question. It goes to the core of our mission, really, as journalists. First of all, for those of us that are in lockdown, I'm speaking to you from New York City, so of course I've been in lockdown for quite a while. For those of us that are in lockdown, the hard part of the answer to this is we can't go out and do the digging. I can't safely, and probably not legally, because now we have a $500 fine if we're caught out wandering around without a good reason in New York City. I can't go to the hospitals and double check the facts. I can't go observe firsthand, what are the police doing? What's the health establishment doing? Is the governor correctly stating that we need 30,000 ventilators in New York City? Or is the president right when he says it's okay to have 2 per hospital?
Right.
Which one is telling the truth? Where is truth in that? So we're having to work creatively with a great deal of database searching and phone calls and emails and texts, using the full force of the internet, in all its various facets, to try to sift fact from fiction. For those of you that are not under lockdown and are in countries where it's still possible for you to walk around, now's the time to dig and start building your base of knowledge, so that when you do go under a lockdown, you know what it looks like. What do your hospitals look like? And you have contacts in those hospitals and contacts in the morgues and with the police department and so on. So you're ready to rock and roll when your situation escalates.
That's great. I'm going to ask one more question from the internet. And then Alexis, I'd love it if you could
yes, I will
join the conversation with some thoughts too. So Earth Journalism Network reporter Jennifer Doe from Ghana, a student, says, what measures can journalists employ to craft messages around infectious disease such as COVID-19 to suit the needs of local consumers of information? That issue is, again, here you have a pervasive, this is going to be in every village pretty soon as those dispersals happen. Have you seen models for, whether you call it engagement journalism, whatever you want to label it, what are some of the ways to connect with the local audiences? Radio, of course, is a key in many parts of the world.
Well, first of all, I don't care whether your village is Topeka, Kansas, or your village is in the far north of Ghana. Wherever you go, the base knowledge you have to assume is very low. So you have to start by assuming that your reader or your listener or your viewer doesn't really understand biology very well, doesn't really have a mental image of what a virus is. A word like epidemiology is a meaningless word to them, or virology. All the ologies that we use in science have no meaning for the average person in the village you're targeting. But what do the villagers want to know? They want to know, am I safe? Are my children safe? Am I being told the truth? What if I'm not safe now? What do I have to do to be safe? And those are the bottom lines. It's literally, how many times a day do I have to wash my hands? If we don't have running water that's clean, how do I clean these? If my child is coughing, does Nana risk getting sick? Could the coughing child give it to Nana? The basics are just really real and really raw, and it doesn't matter whether you're in a rich country or a poor country. The basic needs for information are overwhelming. I mean, I get deluged with emails, postings on my website, Twitter direct messaging, and so on from people who are desperate. I mean, desperate for information that I feel government should have provided and is not doing. So, for example, one day I opened up my text messaging in my phone, and there was a message from a police officer in the New York Police Department representing all of the sergeants for all the police precincts across all 5 boroughs of New York City. We have the largest police department in North America. And the message said, no one is telling us how to protect ourselves. We don't know if it's safe as a police officer to go in to break up a domestic violence situation in a household, or to walk the beat, or what do we do? How do we protect ourselves? Well, I was appalled that the medium level officers wouldn't have any idea whether or not they should wear masks. What should they wash their hands? What should they do? And realized I had to intervene. So I wrote a kind of detailed analysis based on prior role-playing exercises we'd been in over the years of outbreaks and police responses. And the response back was a tearful, overwhelming sense of gratitude, saying, you may have just saved some lives in the New York Police Department. Nobody told us any of these things. We had no idea. And you multiply that times hundreds and hundreds of different people coming at me asking, should I have my daughter come home from college, or is it better if she stays in that town? Should we cancel our vacations? Is it safe to travel? All of this kind of stuff just pouring in. Now, it's not my job, but I feel a moral obligation to at least direct them to databases or URLs somewhere, a website, something. Nobody's paying me to do any of this.
I know. We'll get back to that in a minute.
This is just what I have to do. It's my moral obligation.
So Alexis, you're at Dartmouth College. You teach journalism. You have a context in the history of journalism as well, and you worked with Lori in Newsday.
Lori was writ large. I was covering Brooklyn, but yeah, Brooklyn is the world.
It is.
I'm actually going to wait a little bit to ask a bunch of questions. My students aren't coming on board for the most part till 1, and I have a collection of their questions. But I lived in the Castro district in the early 80s, 1980s in San Francisco, and the disconnect between exactly what you said, seeing people, and I lived with someone who was a social worker for the AIDS Foundation. So all of her clients, we would walk past them every day. And, they were trying colonic irrigation. There were all these sort of, magic pills, none of which worked. And we'd watch, not just people I didn't know, but people I knew and loved very deeply die at the same time that, Reagan didn't mention the word AIDS till, what was it, 1985?
Yeah.
And that, we've used the word Cassandra, but gaslighting, that sense of, and I think we have that now when we watch Trump, on the evening news, the evening follies. So I just wanted to share with you that sense of not just the craziness of what's going on, but that feeling of disconnect, and why I think that drives some of the panic people are feeling. The other thing I wanted to share with you and ask you to comment on is that, and I can't remember now if it was Tony Fauci or some other person who was a very leading researcher and leader of sort of helping people push through the AIDS epidemic in the 80s and actually into the 90s. It was either Fauci or someone else who said, I'm actually really glad we didn't have social media back then, because that would have made our job so much harder. Yep. And, the crazy demonization of Fauci by right-wing conspiracy theorists now. There's a piece in the Times the other day, but you don't have to look far to find that. Just this idea that the work you do makes you vulnerable to trolling and hatred and death threats. I mean, I think it is partly that you're a woman reporter. I don't think it's just what you're writing about. And anyway, I thought that perspective by Fauci was interesting. And I just thought I guess one more thing is that when I was a reporter for New York Newsday in the 80s, being concerned about AIDS made some people question your sexuality.
Yeah.
And I remember that very well because I am gay, and it was a little bit of a balancing act to figure out, okay, I got picked to cover the gay parade, and going into gay communities. And it is important to understand those communities from a personal perspective. But, there was a question of, does that challenge your objectivity? Right? So anyway, I just wanted to throw all that out there as sort of my parallel experience of covering AIDS, not in anything like the scope and span you did, but just, Brooklyn and San Francisco in the 80s.
Yeah, those are all really good points you raise, Alexis. And to bring it to today and what we're dealing with this pandemic, I think there's some really big lessons. I mean, it's interesting to me that a bunch of the AIDS activists that originally founded ACT UP and survived and are now very much with us today, thankfully, have now taken on fighting the shortages of face masks, of test kits, of ventilators as their cause, and using the toolkit that they so successfully used in the ACT UP fight to get medicines for people with HIV. And I've heard from them, and they're out in the trenches now, trying to understand why. For example, I happen to know that there's a whole shipload of masks and so on sitting off Portland, Oregon, and U.S. Customs is not letting it in because they're from China. And I know of multiple efforts around the United States to bring supplies in where they're being blocked by the FDA or U.S. Customs because they, quote, don't meet our standards. I was just hearing in the UK of a group that has used 3D printers to make special face masks for healthcare workers, super protective, that almost ensure they won't get any virus, around in their nose or mouth. And the British government refuses to certify them. So every doctor who orders one from this 3D printing company has to do it secretly and smuggle them into the hospitals past the National Health Service monitors in order to wear them and protect themselves. Here in Brooklyn, we have any number of healthcare workers using their own techniques, their own methods to protect themselves and protect their patients, all knowing that it runs counter to, the official recommendations. But if they wait for the official recommendations, they could die. I think this sense that there is an urgency and a kind of special activism associated with COVID-19 is very real. And it's interesting. I think the most disturbing political thing I have seen, and this is on the American side, but I've seen it mirrored by preliminary data coming out of the UK, France, and we'll see if it's true in Italy. But we see a real divide in public opinion about the urgency of this epidemic based on people's political party affiliation. So, I mean, we have an ideological divide that is determining whether or not people are taking social distancing seriously, whether or not people have the appropriate level of concern about this virus, and whether or not they think, there's a proper way to balance the economy against the epidemic. The president has at various times, President Trump, gone one way or another across those divides. Today, he seems to be on the side of the epidemic is so bad that, we have to push the economy issues to the side for now. But last week, he was in completely the opposite place. And similarly, Boris Johnson and his government in the UK, we saw a divide that went along the Brexit lines. Were you yes or no for pulling the UK out of the EU? Those who favored Brexit, withdrawing from the EU, also tended to downplay the severity of the epidemic and favored the notion that, well, we should just kind of let the virus spread along. Some people will die, but eventually there'll be herd immunity, they said.
Right.
And the herd immunity will allow humanity of the Emerald Islands, et cetera, to survive the epidemic. Well, too late. Many weeks of preparedness time lost, but once the prime minister himself had COVID, as did the minister of health, as did the chief medical officer of the UK. Then all of a sudden, we have real urgency in the UK and a real deep sense that we've got to cut across this political divide, take social distancing seriously, shut down the pubs, and so on. I think, unfortunately, all over the world, there are political divides that are running counter to rapid preparedness and response. A really good example is Sweden. Sweden still allows you to go to restaurants, go to bars, hang out, do whatever you want. And the Swedes seem to have this feeling that somehow they're going to rise above all this. And just in the last couple of days, you're starting to see real urgency in Sweden. Overall, I think, for every reporter covering this story, it's really, really urgent to understand that nobody wants their economy to tank because they came out of the chute running in an attack against the virus. And so every political leader finds themselves listening with one ear to their stock market, their big, rich oligarchy, whatever's the most powerful, wealthiest group, and with another ear listening to their public health people. And if the messages from the two sides are completely opposite, the politics of that politician determines which gets the balance.
There's a question.
The journalist is to lay out the positions very clearly and to call them what they are, and so that the reader or the viewer or the listener is able to formulate a well-advised opinion about what's going on.
There is Michael Balter, who's, I believe, a journalism professor, also has some students tuned in. He posted this very relevant question.
Yeah.
This gets to what do journalists do? Should we just not broadcast those press briefings, which are artfully put right at prime time evening news time, or what's the approach there? I had tweeted the other day, why not just ask the questions specifically of the back line, the people behind Trump? Although now he doesn't do it that way. He comes to the microphone alone. And so even that option has been off the shelf. Do we just ignore president, or how does that work? I mean, it seems like
Michael's asking a really important question. And of course, I would expect nothing but important questions from Michael Balter. For those of you who don't know, he used to be a top science writer based in Paris for a long time. And now some students here in New York are very lucky to be in his graduate seminars. Michael, you're asking a question that I actually see floating around in journalist circles quite a bit lately, and a lot of op-eds written and so on. Now, this is a very American question, so I apologize to all our international viewers that may think we're getting a little too inside baseball about U.S. politics. But we have a situation where we're in an election year. Theoretically, we'll see if it happens. In November, we're going to have a national election and choose the next president of the United States. From the very beginning of this epidemic, Donald Trump, our incumbent president, has very much used a lot of aspects of the epidemic, whether he was denying it as a problem or accentuating it as a problem, to bolster his own campaign initiatives and his own political standing in opposition to the Democrats. And of course, we entered this year with this huge list of candidates on the Democrat side, holding debates and going back and forth. And that list eventually winnowed down to two. And they're both on the field still, Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. They've all but disappeared from public view. At this point, there are no longer rallies, obviously. There are no longer big campaign speeches, obviously, because it's too dangerous. And both of them try to do faltering steps in social media. In contrast, the president can call national media to his attention like that. And every single network preempts whatever they're doing, all the cable news, all of the radio networks, and they all allow the president to have an hour or more of airtime in which to talk about all the great things he says he's doing to counter this epidemic. And I think that Michael's question goes to the core problem here. Is that a campaign rally, or is that actually vital information that the American people need? And I would say it bounces all over the place. I mean, the White House briefing that we all saw yesterday was probably the strongest, best informed, and most vital briefing we've received since the epidemic began. It was the first time there was a modicum of truth, and the truth was terrible. The truth was, if we do everything right from now on, we somehow deal with all the mistakes that have been made. And the list of mistakes made by this government is so long, we don't have time to go through it all. But if we somehow correct all those mistakes, we all do social distancing, every single city, town, all 50 states, all the territories, everybody goes into social distancing. We somehow corral the resources to care for all the sick and to isolate them from those who aren't yet infected. If that miracle occurs, we could still have nearly 250,000 dead people before the middle of this summer. It's a horrible, horrible truth. And worse, if the failures continue, if the mistakes continue, that number could well be more than 1 million. 1 million dead in the United States. I mean, that dwarfs everything we have faced as American people as a threat to American civilians going back all the way to 1918, and in fact would dwarf that figure for United States losses, which were more in the ballpark of about 600,000 people affected in 1918. And it takes us all the way to the Civil War of the mid-19th century. So
Right.
the bottom line, did we need yesterday's press conference? Yes, we did. Did we need all of these press briefings every single day and every single time Donald Trump wants to use the forum in order to brag about the achievements and start getting off the topic and talking about how he saved the economy and how the Chinese are so evil and this and that? No, we don't need all that. But who's going to strike that balance? And how do we do that? What mechanism is available? The president can call a thing anytime he wants. And he clearly has realized that these White House press briefings are replacing the big Trump rallies he used to use to rally his base and his troops. And by the way, they're working. His ratings are going steadily up.
Right. I wanted to swing back to the social media question, just to give people a little lens on someone else to pay attention to on the media side of things. Jay Rosen at NYU has been essentially 24/7 identifying and crystallizing these challenges for the media. And Brian Stelter at CNN as well has done a really good job of digging in on how and it really is a conundrum. And this goes beyond the epidemic, the pandemic, but it's how can the media help the public sustain a reality check when the system can be so easily hijacked. This goes back to Trump's early adoption of Twitter as a way to counteract or sidetrack the media conversation. And that leads me back to something I posted here visually a couple of minutes ago, which was Lori's really important piece in The Lancet, a commentary a couple of weeks ago, which was about the underinvestment in communication capacity in the organizations that the media relies on in the public for information. Now, if you search on the World Health Organization website, they've had some pretty significant staff working on getting through the internet, getting through the misinformation, whether it's political or just mythology, and the investment we make in the communication environment, the infrastructure, people tracking social media, not just putting out a tweet, but getting engaged on those when you see a countervailing myth circulating. And again, this goes back to Ebola, where people had all kinds of misinformation. That's why they were leaving Ebola zones with their dead relatives dressed up in the back seat, so they could avoid those evil medical workers. There are efforts underway to get more impact in that end of the communication landscape, the people of the science organizations, whether it's universities or WHO or CDC, it feels like an important opportunity as well. Lori, could you just give a quick snapshot before we go to the students on what you need, what you need to draw on that isn't there, or what you think the public landscape needs more of, as you laid out in that Lancet piece?
Well, what I was trying to say in this piece, I was very appalled that the entire World Health Organization media operation boiled down to 5 human beings for the entire planet, every single time zone, every single language, one of whom dealt with social media. So everything, every lie on the internet, one human being was trying to counter on behalf of the World Health Organization. It defies all imagination. How could anybody think this made any sense at all? The numbers are not much better if you look out across any of the major public health institutions that the public relies on, whether it's our Centers for Disease Control, the Chinese Center for Disease Control, the Africa CDC, the Africa regional offices of WHO, the European CDC, go on and on and on down a long list of institutions, some of them UN connected, some of them utterly independent, but that are reliable voices of public health, or are meant to be. And you see that the last thing they think about when they go through their budget every year is their communications department. It's like, way down the totem pole. The MDs are always up here, right? and everybody that doesn't have an MD is down and down and down and down. And then you get to the communications officers who lack both MDs and PhDs, and so the result is that, I at one point realized that one of the people I was texting to cross-check information with at WHO was answering my texts at 3 a.m, her time in Geneva. And then that I was seeing her in the press room at, 8 a.m. Geneva time. And this was going on day after day. And I started to worry that these people were all going to burn out. They were all going to suffer illness and not make it. So that's what prompted me to start thinking, how can we issue a proper call about where priorities should be? Well, a place like Facebook is spending now, under pressure, hundreds of millions of dollars to pay people to develop algorithms that will spot trolls and pull them off Facebook. And Twitter's doing the same, and so on. And they're all doing it as a result of political pressure that started with concerns about pedophiles 5 or 6 years ago, and now includes COVID-19 disinformation. But they can never get ahead of it. I mean, that's impossible. They can do all they want, but they're never going to manage to find every bogus cure being sold on Facebook, every Russian-inspired troll factory putting out hatred and misdirecting people, etc. Far better is to take just a modicum of that money and pour it into developing 21st century, really good communications capacities and personnel inside of these institutions so that they become a reliable, steady, timely, up to the second source of information, answering and leading the charge. Unfortunately, most institutions that are related to global health, epidemics, and so on, follow the old sort of, I would say, 1960s, 20th century mode of operation, which is hold a press conference, speak to the press, meaning the handfuls of people that still actually earn a living by writing articles or reporting for broadcast, and are sitting in a room looking at you behind a dais as you answer their questions. And then maybe put out a press release, that somebody's going to read. And that's pretty much what they think communications is.
Right.
And that's just like ridiculous. That's so out of date, so absurd. I don't even know where to get started.
So, and this is the landscape that journalism students face coming as they come through their programs. If anyone wants to take a brief break, we're about 1 hour in, and I'm tempted, but I'm going to try to keep at my seat. This is a good moment. We're going to hear from students in a minute. I want to share a screen one more time. There are journalism organizations scrambling to offer resources. The TOE Center at the Journalism School at Columbia, DART Center, I'm sorry, is one. The Solutions Journalism Network, those journalists is offering advice. The Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting is offering grants right now. I'll pull up their the window of them in a minute. There's a National Geographic Society where I was working there until last year, and I'm on the committee that still manages their grants. They've just launched a rapid turnaround fund for journalists, for freelancers. And Lori Garrett, at the top of her game, at the top of this issue, is struggling to keep up financially. But there are journalists around the world now grappling with this issue who can offer their communities a way forward through better coverage, who are scrambling just to they can't really do their job right now. They're locked in, or they're going to be. National Geographic, this announcement has only been up for like 3 days, and they had 270 applications. Their staff was up all night 2 nights ago going through them, and they're doing very quick turnaround grants, small grants for journalists. But so much more support for both communication capacity generally, community engagement, getting communities engaged in their own way forward is a key point when you face an issue too big for any one reporter. So we'll talk about that starting in a couple of minutes. Lori and Alexis, if you want to pause and breathe, now's a good moment.
Okay, let's keep going. I think we've got a momentum, and I'm sure that more people are logging in now to participate. Students are coming on board from around the United States and hopefully all over the world.
And folks, by the way, folks who are watching now, this is a good moment to tweet this again, put it on your Facebook feed directly, so you can build a community for this next hour, which is going to focus on not just students, but also actionable steps that journalists who are just struggling with this issue can pursue. So Alexis, you have a list there. There are more coming in on the direct feed for questions as well. So we will not run out, I'm sure.
Well, I should preface this by saying this, by the way, this is day one of our class. So
wow.
With a big bang, and thanks to both of you for doing this. My class is really a mad dash through modern U.S. history, or 20th century in U.S. history, through the lens of journalism. So one of the things I was hoping you would talk about, and you already have, which is, I'm really glad this is being recorded for students who didn't hear it, are the parallels and contrasts between the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918, the AIDS epidemic, actually pandemic in the 80s. Of course, it extended beyond the 80s, but in those initial years, and how government and the media are dealing with coronavirus right now. So that's what a lot of my students' questions were about. It's really kind of open-ended. If you just wanted to sort of talk about that generally.
I was looking for some books I was going to grab off my shelf here, but I can't, I don't have a library with filing cards and things well organized. But of course, anybody who wants to look at the parallels with the 1918 flu need go no further than John Barry, Barry, and his great influenza book, which is focused on the United States response, but it really helps you understand all the things that could go wrong. And it's really remarkable how many things have already happened here with COVID-19 that have parallels to these historic trends. For example, in 1918, one of the real challenges for health officers all over the world who were trying to control this epidemic, and keep in mind, they barely knew what viruses were at the time. And they certainly had no scientific understanding of influenza at all. So, how do you kill a virus? They had no idea. So they were dealing with trying to stop the spread of disease by preventing human to human transmission by blocking those humans one way or another. So quarantine was an essential tool. And what we now call social distancing was the tool in 1918, as it is now emerging to be the primary tool in our modern pandemic. And one of the things you saw as a problem everywhere around the world, everywhere, in every culture, was the interface between public health authorities and religious authorities.
Mm-hmm.
So that religious gatherings continued to take place even when they were very dangerous. And whatever religion it might be, I mean, this is not exclusive to any faith, would insist that their God or gods protected them and that they needed to come together to pray through whatever religious means they would adhere to prayer as a form of acknowledging a higher being. And in case after case in 1918, influenza was amplified and then spread outwards into the communities by these religious gatherings. Today, what we see is two epidemics for sure are entirely spawned by religious gatherings. One is in Iran, where Qom is the sacred pilgrimage site for the Shia, and pilgrimages that were taking place in February continued, even though clearly COVID-19 cases were among the pilgrims. And even when health authorities said this has to stop, when high-level Iranian authorities said this is too dangerous, the imams absolutely refused to stop the gatherings, and the Ayatollah made no comment one way or another to referee the debate. The result was that Qom became this amplification episode that now has a completely out of control epidemic in Iran that's claimed people all the way up to the state council surrounding the Ayatollah, and a very dangerous situation in Iran. And similarly in South Korea, we saw a religious cult that is Christian, with about 250,000 followers, continued to hold gatherings. And some of those gatherings involved their missionaries that had gone to Wuhan and came back with virus unknowingly. And even though clearly COVID was in the community and was beginning to spread, they insisted, they kept holding their religious gatherings. And some of these apparently involved, more than 10,000 people at a time. And that caused amplification and explosion of the South Korean crisis. Here in the United States, we've now seen several Christian religious leaders who have insisted on continuing to hold religious gatherings despite all claims that it would be very dangerous. Jerry Falwell Jr., for example, who's quite a powerful evangelical figure in the United States, has reopened his Liberty University, which is a Christian university. And there are now students who are infected, and they're on campus, a few thousand students. And there was just the recent arrest of an evangelical leader in the United States who insisted on holding a giant gathering of thousands of followers, despite police orders to the contrary. All over the world, this conflict you could see historically has occurred. And of course, it gets exacerbated by religious doubts about science itself. So the credibility of the scientific message and evidence is undermined if faith is thought to have a higher authority. So faith as a principle does not need to have data behind it. Almost by definition, faith is in the absence of data. Belief in God or gods does not require proof, right? I mean, some of us are skeptics. We need proof. I'm a reductionist, forgive me. But there are plenty of people for whom religion is a core principle in their lives. It gives them a reason to get up every morning and a reason to do good in the world. And it is not based on empiricism. Now, the problem is if you take out empirical needs entirely, then when an event that can only be solved empirically arises, it's all too easy for religion to doubt the entire empirical basis of the response. So we see this over and over again in history. I mean, you don't have to go very far, very deep in your readings about the 14th century Black Death to see that, burning Jews at the stake and hanging female witches from the trees and the rafters were considered viable cures for the plague. And that mixing of religious and scientific principles, or the conflict between them, has been a constant throughout history and very much present today. I've seen it in every Ebola outbreak. And of course, I documented in my first book principles that were outlined more in detail by Tamfo Moyembe of Zaire, that now called Democratic Republic of Congo, and Peter Piot of Belgium, who now runs the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, detailing the role that missionary Catholics from Belgium played in spreading Ebola in 1976 in Yambuku in the original outbreak. And it was the reuse of 5 syringes over and over and over again on populations of children and young adults, injecting them basically with Ebola unknowingly over and over again in order to bring people to the Catholic fold in this particular church. A huge mistake.
So it would be great to zoom in on, there was a comment that came in about some practices that you would recommend to journalists and also for students to consider going forward. And you brought up this point the other day about a study that's gotten a huge amount of attention. And there's so many studies right now that are done in this rapid turnaround way, where without full peer review. And it would be great to think in the next few minutes, and this might relate, I'm sure there's some questions that Alexis's students have as well, who on practices as a journalist. So not just the source thing, who do I call? That's one. But how do I treat new news in an emerging problem like this? And you might want to talk about this because it got everyone's attention, including the president's, chloroquine.
Well,
I call it single study syndrome.
One huge difference between science reporters and all other beats is that we rely heavily on the scientific literature, and well done scientific research is usually divided into a paper that classically states the problem, the sort of history of the issue, then states what was the methodology used to tackle the problem and come up with an answer, and then has its sort of data section called results, and then a section called discussion, in which the writer, the researcher typically puts forward some hypotheses and some sense of what the implications are of their findings. What's happening right now is that the pace of publication of science far outstrips any of the traditional mechanisms of peer review that allow these sorts of structured papers to be subjected to really serious scrutiny by fellow scientists before they're published. That's all gone. So the first thing everybody needs to understand is that most of the papers, this one is just one of them, but thousands and thousands of papers and claims are now coming out about COVID-19, and everything from does aspirin work to bring a fever down to did China cover up 20,000 cases? These papers are pouring out over the internet, and 90% of them have never undergone peer review. In some cases, scientists are actually posting their theories and their data directly onto Twitter, directly onto Instagram, directly onto Facebook, not even bothering to publish in any kind of traditional journal. And so the result is that a lot of ideas are percolating up all the way to the level of the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of England, the head of WHO, et cetera. These ideas are percolating up that haven't gone through any of the traditional sort of, analyses, clearing, and questioning. Chloroquine is just one of many ideas for treating COVID-19 that has risen all the way up the food chain without ever actually undergoing a strict scientific analysis.
So how
And
do you
there are
handle that? How
any
do you-
number of others that are out there. And so what does that mean for me and for people trying to play the kind of role I'm playing as a journalist in this epidemic? We have to go to the materials and methods section first. When a research paper comes out, you see the bold claim right up at the top. In this case, he's claiming that a combination of chloroquine and AZT equals a treatment for COVID that resulted in only 2 out of his 80 patients that he claims to have looked at succumbing to the disease, and most of them walking out of the hospital free, apparently free of virus within 4 days, 4 to 5 days of treatment. If it were true, if it were accurate, it would mean that every single hospital in the world should immediately start dosing every single patient with a combination of hydroxychloroquine and AZT, and we would see this whole problem go away, right? So given the implications of this, you know, this had to be, you have to jump on this paper. You had to really scrutinize it. And this is, you know, not just, it's not particularly exceptional except for its potential ramifications, but it's typical of a lot of the stuff coming out. So you look at the materials and methods and ask, what did they actually do? Who were the patients they looked at? What were the conditions in which they looked at them? How did they assess their relative success against what? What are they weighing the patient's success against? Well, first thing you realize is there's no control group. Oh, okay. So they have nothing to weigh against except vague historical data. Well, history is only since December. It's not like we have this mountain database that's all authenticated, validated, and proven to be true about what the absence of hydroxychloroquine plus AZT results in terms of patient outcome. But then you also look and realize of those 80 patients, you know, they didn't do exactly the same thing for all 80. And they didn't report on the outcomes of all 80. And the outcome reporting seems to generalize at one level, but specifically to have results at a very different level. My ultimate take is this paper is sloppy garbage, which in the absence of a pandemic would never have passed peer review, would have been subjected, typically if they had submitted it, let's say to Science Magazine or the New England Journal of Medicine, the reviewers would have said, you need a control group, you need this, you need that, go back and redo your work and then resubmit. But in the context of this epidemic and the sense of urgency, this got rushed out. Well, unfortunately, people are already making treatment choices based on this and a couple of other papers. And the sloppiness of the science is being overlooked. Now, the job for the science writer is to provide the skepticism that hopefully will make some people ask the right questions before they start dosing themselves. And of course, we've had incidents of people self-medicating with what they thought was chloroquine. In one tragedy in Arizona, an elderly couple that thought they had COVID took chloroquine, which turned out to be a form used for cleaning fish tanks, and it killed them. It poisoned them.
Amazing. But hopefully there's a self-correcting aspect here. But as you know, that rush to the solution, including in headlines, including in the newsroom, you know, putting the new in front of everything else is a challenge. Alexis, what else is on the list there and in your own brain?
Oh, quite a bit. I mean, I do want to just speak to this rushed process and look back. Again, I know there's a lot of reporters on the line who are looking for practical, what can they do right now. So I hesitate to keep bringing this back to a historical perspective. But Lori, I wonder if you can talk about, you know, a lot of the AIDS activism, ACT UP, other organizations, was about trying to speed up the FDA's process of approving anything that looked like it could help, you know, in the first years, and then going through the 80s. Is there a valid argument here using that as a historical parallel?
Well, of course. I mean, HIV really broke all the rules and changed all the rules. And the rules were not changed because, you know, Tony Fauci changed them, though he definitely agreed with a lot of the changes. The rules were changed because the activists demanded them. They put their bodies on the line, and literally they were facing life or death. So why not put your body on the line to demand that the Food and Drug Administration and the NIH and all these institutions around the world that were involved in searching for treatments act faster, clear their data faster, come up with what was called compassionate use programs, which meant a drug that was still iffy could go through use in otherwise terminal patients to determine whether or not it had efficacy. But here's the difference. With HIV, nobody was advocating that something be pushed out the door untested and without any control group, without any sense of determining whether it was safe, whether it was efficacious, whether if taken together with other available drugs, it was better or worse. What were the side effects? All these things. I mean, nobody on the HIV front that was of any credibility at all, including some of the loudest activists, none of them wanted to rush garbage to the marketplace. They wanted cures. They wanted it to work. What we see today is political leaders taking up the cause of completely unproven, quote unquote, treatments and trying to push them through the pipeline without any real data. As Tony Fauci put it, I'll be happy to implement widespread hydroxychloroquine use the moment I see a decent clinical trial that proves it works. We haven't seen that yet. And if Tony Fauci hasn't seen it, I certainly haven't seen it, because Tony sees things that, before I do, and that come on his desk. And he sees the grant proposals and the suggestions, the things that never are seen publicly. I honestly, if I were sick right now, based on the available data, I would not personally take hydroxychloroquine or AZT or a combination of the two. I don't think it works. And I think there are side effects. And what really worries me, and we haven't seen it really discussed at all in any of the media or frankly, any of the major scientific literature, is what it means for malaria control and frankly, HIV control, if two of the powerful weapons in the armamentarium against those diseases start being used willy-nilly for COVID-19. And this would be especially my concern for sub-Saharan Africa.
Right.
We're already seeing shortages of anti-malarial drugs. We're already seeing issues. Chloroquine, the big problem with chloroquine used to treat malaria is that the parasites readily develop resistance against it. Mm-hmm. So you have to go to other drugs to treat malaria. And an ongoing problem between a lot of sub-Saharan African governments and China has been the willingness of China to export bogus formulations of chloroquine and other anti-malarial drugs that have substandard dosing and therefore promote the reemergence of drug-resistant forms of the microbes in people's bodies. And then it becomes harder and more expensive to treat them when they actually develop malaria. Malaria is one of the biggest killers on the planet. We can't afford to lose that armamentarium because of bogus science regarding its potential use for COVID-19. And similarly, AZT is no longer, a top drug of choice for treatment of HIV disease. We have much better drugs out there right now, and they are available to people all over the world. But if you start willy-nilly using AZT, you might promote mechanisms of resistance that cross classes of anti-HIV drugs. And that could have an effect on the reliability of existing medicines in Africa. And that would be really a tragic outcome. So I'm really worried that these wild ideas coming out in the rich world could end up having not too much of an impact for the rich world, but a huge impact for the developing world, and in ways that are really deleterious to people suffering from other diseases, not from COVID-19. And that would be a horrible outcome.
Okay, I want to go to some of the questions that my students have, and they're all over the map. We did watch a podcast that you did, Lori, with the New Republic last week. So that's sparked some of these questions. So one of them is really about the private profit motive with the pharmaceuticals and also just with hospitals. This says, based on what Lori told the New Republic, by the end of the 90s, the pharmaceutical industry in the US was reduced to about 10 profit-focused companies. This has posed a problem in the face of COVID-19 because companies are not motivated to increase productions of masks, for example, when instead they could have states bid against each other for scarce supplies. Additionally, healthcare privatization in the US had proved that it could turn a profit. Therefore, having an empty hospital bed became synonymous with bad economics and lost profits. So now we are faced with the coronavirus and a lack of beds. So I wonder if you could just address that that issue as at least in the U.S. we're facing lethal scarcities.
So this is a great question. Thanks to the student who put that forward. First of all, I have written the cover story for the next issue of the New Republic. It'll be coming out sometime in the next 7 or 8 days.
Okay.
And it deals with the two people I feel are most responsible for this pandemic. You'll have to get it to find out.
People should use Twitter to post their guesses.
Yeah, you can post your guesses of who the two people are who are most responsible for the global pandemic. But in the process of a podcast that the New Republic did to sort of set up this upcoming issue, we did talk about some of the profit motive issues. So this is an example of something where if you're going to be on the beat, you need to have steeped yourself in research that you bring to your daily or weekly reporting. You may not ever actually report directly on it, but it has to inform how you analyze it, what's going on in the world for your beat. So, of course, if you're in biomedical fields, you have to understand how the pharmaceutical industry works. You have to understand what dramatic changes historically occurred to the pharmaceutical industry over the last 50, 60 years that have placed us in a precarious situation today. So back in the 50s and 60s, in this sort of golden age of explosion in pharmaceutical and vaccination solutions to infectious diseases, when we came up with the polio vaccine, the measles vaccine, the mumps vaccine, whooping cough, all the antibiotics, all of the antiviral agents of the early period and so on, just an absolute amazing explosion that turned around life expectancy all across the world. I mean, first in the wealthy world, but it then quickly translated into changes in the developing world as well, because suddenly children could reach the age of 12 without having life-threatening experience or, in fact, existential experience with infectious disease. And the number one reason life expectancy, has gone into the 80s in so many societies is that it's a data balance having to do with you lost that death toll of children. Infants made it to toddlers, toddlers made it to children, children made it to adults. And, 200 years ago, that set of transitions was a series of lethal points. But because of the revolution carried out by pharmaceutical companies all over the world, translating discoveries from research labs to commercial production and availability around the world, we had a really dramatic change. In those days, most of these companies were relatively small, and they were family-owned companies often. They existed in every country around the world, and they tended to operate as private companies, not publicly traded. What happened beginning in the 80s and then with great pace and vigor in the 90s was a giant swallowing operation where bigger companies bought up and swallowed up the smaller companies. And as they did so, went publicly traded. And so you saw the whole world of pharmaceuticals and vaccine production consolidate down to a smaller and smaller pool of huge mega corporations, which had increasingly allegiance to their investors. and the whole pharmaceutical sector became a major trading sector in global stock markets. This was true, by the way, whether they were patent making companies or generic manufacturers. I know a lot of people in the HIV world feel like the generics are the good guys and the patent makers are the bad guys. But what we've seen is it cuts across and the lines are blurred between who makes generics, who makes patents. And it's really a very small number of companies now. And they are international. They have fingers in every country around the world. And they require a very high profit return on their investments. Now, one big change that coincided with this movement towards devouring small companies into the ever larger ones is that in the same time frame, a big breakthrough happened. That breakthrough was the discovery of statins and their ability to prevent people from developing lethal heart disease by lowering cholesterol. That set of discoveries has saved a lot of lives, but it also created a whole new model for the pharmaceutical industry, because rather than developing a cure, you developed a maintenance therapy.
Right.
And the maintenance therapy had to be taken every day for the rest of your life. And suddenly, a whole profit center was discovered that was massive. I mean, the average pharmaceutical company was making, by the end of the 90s, more off of any one statin than they were off of practically everything else in their portfolio. And more we've seen the industry move away from curative medicine into maintenance therapy, prevention medicine, if you want, so that they're for more and more types of diseases, including cancer, rather than finding a curative dose of chemotherapy that might obliterate the tumor cells in your body. We're going to put you on a maintenance therapy that costs $100,000 a year, that keeps you alive for X number of years. And, you know, I don't want to portray, I am not one of those who thinks the whole pharmaceutical industry is a bunch of evil monsters. I don't think that at all. And I think that no service is done by activists who make such claims. But we have seen the goalposts of success for drugs, success for medicines shift to such high profit return potential that it almost obliterates the possibility that anything that's really curative for a disease that affects poor people can possibly get through the pipeline, unless there's a huge special investment program created, analogous to what's been done with PEPFAR for HIV treatment in the world. And so you have institutions created like Gavi, the Global Alliance of Vaccinators, that provide certain kinds of financial incentives to keep vaccine manufacturers on the playing field and to provide them with profit returns sufficient for them to keep their factories open and keep manufacturing measles vaccines, keep manufacturing mumps vaccines amid a cacophony of anti-vaccine forces, litigators, lawsuits, and so on. And similarly, if we're waiting for a treatment for COVID, we have to realize that the treatment will be available in rich countries first because we can pay for it. And it will be billed at a rate that is pushing the envelope of what the insurance industry is willing to compensate. You know, take it right to the pain point, and that's the charge. But what does that mean if you're in Ghana? What does that mean if you're in Bangladesh? What does that mean if you're in the Philippines? What does that mean if you're in Brazil? You know, you're not going to have access to this drug. And the same with vaccine. I think all science reporters, everybody covering this pandemic, if you're writing a vaccine story, you have a social responsibility to not just talk about whether company X has a promising vaccine in the pipeline, but whether company X has any scheme built into that would make that an affordable, accessible vaccine for people who live in, you know, the bottom 50% poorest countries on earth. Because we're not going to stop this pandemic with a vaccine unless everybody in the world gets vaccinated, right? Not just the rich world, because it'll just keep coming back and back and back to the rich world from the poor world if we've not ever vaccinated the poorer world. So unless you're prepared to take these issues on, you're going to be writing stories that are more like advertising for these companies than real investigative journalism and really informative analysis that pushes the envelope and takes the reader or the listener or the viewer to new insights that are meaningful.
And you said something there that's invaluable, I think, for a reporter anywhere in the world or coming into the world can draw from, which is start with your community. Yeah. In other words, vaccine news. Okay, that sounds exciting, but what does that mean for where I am? And with all those contexts. And also, of course, what you're saying very valuably to any journalists out there is that this is a story of every specialty. There's a business aspect to it. There's a social aspect to it. There's a justice aspect to it. Like climate change, these other grand challenges are not one story. It's not a health story. It's all stories. And that has two facets. One is, well, maybe we can collaborate. A journalist specialized in business and one who specializes in health. Or backing to that other frame, which is the best one. Start with the community, whoever is your reader, whoever is your listener, if you're a radio journalist, a podcaster, if you're starting something new. And every journalist right now has to figure out how to start something new because the old kinds of jobs are not there. Start with the audience you want to focus on and build it backwards from vaccine news to that year. Alexis, what else is on your mind? On your list?
This is a juicy one. One of my students is in Italy, luckily not in a part of Italy where the virus is most deadly. And she's talking about Italy's politics of terror versus Trump's false optimism. I have seen what the effects of a continuous pessimism have been on my country, Italy. Last week, the government showed videos of trucks carrying dead people who knows where. I have come to the conclusion that spreading terror to be sure that people remain locked inside their homes is not always the answer. The most fragile people are already scared. Scaring them even more while they are at home alone and isolated might have more harmful effects on them. I do realize it is a controversial topic, as illusion is definitely violating an individual's right to know, but I think that achieving a balance between Italy's politics of terror and Trump's exaggerated optimism might be the best option in such a difficult time.
Well, that's an interesting question. Now, I don't think it's the job of the reporter to determine the cultural balance of messaging from government, right? It's the job of the reporter to ask the question, is this the appropriate messaging? And to figure out who are experts that know how to analyze the answer to that. What I have experienced over the years in one epidemic after another is that I get accused of being a fearmonger at some point. And someone claims I'm exaggerating. Someone claims I'm sensationalizing. I think I'm stating the facts, and I'm working to do only that. But certainly when I was reporting on this in December and January, particularly on Twitter, a lot of my readers were accusing me of making much ado about nothing. What's this big deal about this Wuhan thing? You're once again trying to scare us. But of course, having been through 9/11 firsthand, been through Hurricane Sandy firsthand, been through God knows how many epidemics and earthquakes and hurricanes, I know that there's always a point where fear becomes debilitating. And where after a sustained period of time, under duress, such as we're now experiencing with mass lockdowns, fear easily turns to anger. And the anger is easily misdirected. So, for example, many years ago when I was working for National Public Radio, I covered a earthquake in California, one of our many earthquakes. I've been through God knows how many earthquakes. But this one had taken a real toll in one specific small town. And a lot of the structures in the town had collapsed, and people were afraid to go back in their homes. So they were sleeping in tents out outdoors, as we often see following earthquakes all over the world. And they weren't getting much sleep. Every time the ground shook again, they woke up. And so after about a week, you had an incredibly stressed population living outdoors, almost completely sleep deprived, no restful sleep, and running out of all essential supplies, including safe water. The mayor had told the town, well, the water's not safe to drink, so you have to drink something else. Well, that gave every guy in the town the excuse to pour the vodka and pour the whiskey because the water's not safe. And the result was a combination of sleep deprivation, fear, anger, and alcohol.
Wow.
Whoa. So, of course, you start having gun violence. You start having physical attacks on journalists, physical attacks on outside political leaders coming in. And it just became a recipe for total disaster. And I walked out of that situation back in the 80s thinking, there's a lot of lessons there. You have to figure out, when are you firing up more fear, and when is fear misdirected to rage or misdirected to inappropriate social behavior? And how do you find the right balance in that equation? Again, I don't think it's the job of the journalist to set the societal balance. That's what leadership is about, right? Unfortunately, our leader keeps changing his mind. So we don't know what the balance is in America. It's different every single press conference that Donald Trump holds. I think the British people faced the same thing with Boris Johnson. It was a real dramatic change over time. In Italy, they've seen this change over time. Certainly, if you're in Lombardy today,
right,
and you're a mayor in Lombardy today, you're going around yelling at people. And we've all seen these videos saying, get back in the house. What are you doing outside? You're spreading the disease, blah, blah, blah. And you see with these politicians that the fear and anger have completely mixed. They are one and the same emotionally. It's the job of the journalist, even if you're living in the middle of it and you're a human being, you're feeling it all too. But somehow you have to get past both those emotions, both the fear and the rage, to finding the facts and stating the facts. And you need periodically, for something that goes on as long as this will. And I will tell you, I think we're in for a 36-month battle at least. If as long as this will go on, it's going to be your job to periodically step away from the computer, step away from the TV, stick your head out the window, shout, scream, do something that lets your brain, reset. And reset so that your sort of cognitive empirical functions over here and your emotions and fear and rage are over here, and you remember where the boundaries are, because it can become completely consuming.
Is that what you do? Do you stick your head out the window?
Well, I go up to the roof.
Yeah. Okay.
I go up to the roof, shout, do some exercises, and then at 7:00 every night here in New York, people all stick their heads out the windows and shout for the healthcare workers.
Oh, yeah.
And that's a helpful
That's
thing to
interesting.
do.
The guy who is the incoming director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at Columbia, Jeff Schulgemilch, posted a wonderful commentary the other day that it's on Twitter and the like, where he said, and this is like I talked a minute ago about what journalists can do. We've been talking a lot about that, but the news consumer has to do that same thing. And he talked about the value of, as a consumer of news, not just as the reporter thinking about how to help my community. It's like step back from that barrage, whether it's the White House or social media, and ask yourself, what can I do today to make my life a little safer? And then once I'm safe in my family, then what can I do for my community?
Well, I would add to that, in many countries in the world, including Italy, including the United States, including the UK, including most of Europe and much of Africa, you have very partisan media. And, if you spend 5 hours with MSNBC on in the background at home here in the United States, after 5 hours, you want to go out and lynch Donald Trump. right? But if you spent the same 5 hours with Fox News on, you're ready to go blow up the New York Times, right?
Yeah.
And in any country you go to around the world, there are news outlets that are really mouthpieces for particular ideologies, particular political functions. If you oversaturate with one view, you end up with such a distorted perspective on the planet and on your own, mortality, your own threat assessment, that you can go completely nuts. And so, I mean, I actually force myself to try and, switch around, see what all the different, and understand how did
Me
they
too.
reach that perspective? How did they draw that conclusion from this set of facts? Oh, I see. It's not facts. It's false. Where did that falsehood come from? And why did they end up adopting that narrative? I think it's really helpful. For the New Republic piece I wrote, that again is going to come out sometime in the next week or so, I spent a lot of time devouring information from China, particularly from early December through mid-February, to understand what the Chinese Communist Party was putting out, what was going on social media, and what kind of outside perspective was being applied from, say, Singapore or Hong Kong or Taiwan, that offered another set of interpretation, but through their prism and their politics. And I think it's a very interesting experience to go through that, with my own country kind of removed from the picture for a while, because it brings you back to fresh thinking about how you look at information in your own country. China has, if you go back to, I believe it was either the last week of November or the first week of December, China started a national campaign that said, "Be patriotic, never wear a mask." And they had pictures that looked like superheroes from Marvel Comics that were wearing masks, and their eyes looked slightly Western, not quite Chinese eyes, and their hair was disheveled, and they had a kind of evil, sinister look to them, and they're wearing masks. Why would they have done that? Because China is instituting the largest surveillance campaign in the world based on artificial intelligence.
Wow.
They can pick out anybody's face from any camera anywhere in all of China, and they have this new point system in place where they award you social points for behaving in ways that are good for China, for the people of China. And that system only works if they can see you, which they can't if you're wearing a mask. And so here we were at the dawn, now we know, of this great pandemic in China. And the actual social messaging put out officially by the government was, never wear a mask. If you wear a mask, you're not being a patriot, and you're therefore a suspect human being, right?
Wow.
Could I jump in with another question here?
Yeah, we have about 10 more minutes, so.
I'll just make it one question.
Oh, no, it could be more than one if we do.
Okay. This is my question, but it also is a question I know my students have. You've talked earlier today about how this is strengthening the hand of autocrats. Obviously, Orban in Hungary is a prime example, but you can see it across the globe, and you can see it also here. I had a student, so there's that, which I'd love you to comment on. There was a piece in the Times, there's pieces everywhere, but, Hungary is the first democracy lost to the coronavirus. That's probably overstating it. I think that democracy was lost a while ago, but but also it's cementing it. Okay, let's put it that way. But I had a student last term from China who was talking about, from the U.S., tapping into social media in China and saying, and this was around the time that Dr. Li died, the guy who was actually
Li Wenliang,
ophthalmologist, but yeah. And so people were able to see very clearly the contrast between this hero who had been basically, dragged to the precinct by the police and made to sign a statement that he was making up the danger. And she was saying that actually among her peer group, there was this sort of democratizing a power of knowing that very clearly that the government was lying to them. And I thought I'd be very interested in hearing whether they're, obviously what's happening in Hungary is probably the majority of that's the force, this, strengthening in the hand of autocrats. We can see that in this country, but is there also a countervailing understanding that when people know that governments are lying to them about life and death issues, does that strengthen any kind of democratizing force?
Yeah. Well, a couple things. First, on China, what I would say is that if you look at what was going on social media, immediately respond in the day, February 7th, that Li Wenliang died, it was overwhelming. I mean, the people of China from every corner were pouring out a sense of grief and rage. And a lot of the rage was directed at Xi Jinping, directed at the CCP. It wasn't just about some Wuhan authority, right? Mm-hmm. And many of us saw the videos. I mean, the government was tearing this stuff down as fast as they could. You could watch in real time postings disappear right before your eyes, right? Because the government wanted all this rage to go away. But many of us saw the videos of people standing outside their windows, screaming, "They're all liars. They're lying to us." And when the sort of number 3 guy in power in China was sent to Wuhan to do a sort of victory march around, it's still not fully, desecuritized in Wuhan, but this is when they kind of were declaring that, well, we've got it under control. They were expecting that all these people in these high condo towers would shout down, "Yay, thank you, xie xie," right? Didn't happen. They were shouting, "This is all lies. You're a fake." And it boomeranged in their faces. And obviously, Xi Jinping is very well aware that many people have likened the COVID-19 catastrophe to Chernobyl, saying just as Chernobyl brought down the credibility of the Soviet Union and weakened Gorbachev's hand at a critical time, ultimately leading to the fall of the USSR. So COVID and the bungled handling of it in the early stages in China was undermining the credibility of Xi Jinping's personal authority and the CCP generally. And they're very well aware of this. So now there's a whole counter narrative being developed, a giant counter propaganda campaign that goes out all over China every day. And, portraying Xi Jinping as a personal hero who helped bring, China out of this horrible mess, and vilifying the United States, even claiming that the virus originally came from a biological weapons lab in the United States. They are backing off of that claim, but they have never chastised the particular ambassadors who have been fomenting that notion. Now, as we go forward, here's where I think the danger points are, and where I think, to go along with your general question about democracy versus autocratic control of information, where I think you really are challenged as a reporter on the beat. First of all, this will inevitably sweep through refugee camps. There's already indication that in Greece, there was a woman who went through an emergency delivery in a Greek hospital 2 days ago and turned out to have COVID-19. And she's from a refugee camp. So if she had it, it's there. And I think it's inevitable that we will see really horrible burning like a forest fire, like the Australian fires of 3 months ago, burning through refugee populations in northern Syria, in Lebanon, in Iran, up into the Rohingya camps in Bangladesh, and wherever we have millions of people hunkered down in tents, 4 or 5 people per tent, with no safe water to wash their hands with, no possibility of social distancing. We're going to see ravaged impact from this virus. Well, it's almost axiomatic that in conditions where a state has been belligerent already to the refugees and has already sought to sequester them off and blocked their movement across into Europe, blocked their movement across North Africa, blocked their movement into Central Asia, that those people will be vilified, and that there will be attempts to whip the media up with stories of irresponsible behavior by refugees who are knowingly passing their virus to others,
Right.
of vilifying the people, making them out as the enemy instead of the virus. And that's going to be a real challenge for reporters, especially if they're working inside of, say, Turkey today, or Damascus today, or Tehran today. Will you be able to tell the truth on that story?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Philippines.
Philippines. So, if Duterte sees attacking and letting the police loose to control COVID-19, and you're a reporter in Manila, will you be able to tell that story? It's really interesting as we look across Africa, what will happen. We now know that COVID is spreading already in Nigeria and South Africa, the two giant, powerhouses of the continent. In both places, very large percentages of the population live in urban squalor, in townships such as Kailicha of Cape Town, or in just sprawling slums, such as immediately outside of central Nairobi, or in large sections of Lagos in Nigeria. And, traditionally, when problems arise in those communities, government does not respond well, right? And it often gets mixed with long-standing tensions between the government and the very poor. And it will be the duty of journalists in those countries to figure out how to walk that line and tell the truth about what's going on in these communities. Now, to the degree that I have any right to give suggestions to my colleagues in those countries, I would urge you to go now to those communities. Look now and ask the questions now. If there's a disease that's spread by dirty hands, who here has access to soap? Who here has access to clean water to wash their hands with? If disease is spread by crowding, what's the density of housing here? How many people live in that hut, in that shack, in that tent? Where would they go if someone in that hut, shack, or tent was infected? What's their option other than just waiting to get infected themselves?
And by the way,
advance work. Get out there and investigate now, because once it's raging through there, you won't be able to do it. You won't be allowed in, and you won't get access to truth.
And that same advice goes as well for journalists in tornado country or hurricane country in the United States, or any place in the world where we're poised for the hurricane season to come. On top of this, how does evacuation happen? How do centers deal with this? So hopefully one thing you've conveyed, and we're pretty much at the end here,
Yeah.
of course, even as we're at the beginning, is that every journalist has a long raft of storylines here. The key is to keep yourself safe, just like we said earlier, for anyone in the community, starting with your own safety and your own financial situation. That's going to be a tough thing for journalists. There are grants available. I'm hoping that whether it's National Geographic Society, Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting, that philanthropists out there aren't just thinking about the next vaccine, which is really important, but thinking about how to support better communication impact right now. And journalism schools can play a role in this. What can we do in academia to make here at Columbia, we have the Earth Institute, the National Center for Disaster Preparedness, the Public Health Group, Irwin Redlener. What can we all do to foster, to help Lori so she's not one of like 10 people trying to kind of tamp down these little brush fires? And what can we all do to build a more effective communication landscape going forward? Whether you're at a journalism school, whether you're on your community's Facebook group, whether you're in public health and can play a little role on Twitter to clarify when a new vaccine study comes out. Well, make sure this hasn't been peer reviewed yet. Everyone has some little nudge component here so that Lori Garrett and others like her, and there aren't a lot, don't have to sit there literally being devastated by the weight of this. I encourage you all to go on YouTube. Lori did a powerful call to journalists a few weeks back. We were talking with an Iranian journalist, and she said this is worse than war reporting. And she's done war reporting because of that weight of responsibility that comes with every tweet, every digital character you're pushing on your keyboard. And when you hit send or publish as a reporter, there's never been a story quite like this. So, and again, we're just at the beginning. So I'm hoping that, Lori, you were incredibly generous with your time today. 2 hours of your time is a priceless gift to the rest of humanity here to move away from telling the stories to informing people on how they can tell better stories. So deeply appreciative. Alexis Jetter and the other journalism professors and students who are online today, deeply appreciative. We have to build this out, share the result of this, share this video with others, and build it and sustain the conversation going forward. That's
Can I
my
make
job.
one final point?
Of course, well, of course, this is your forum.
One final point, because I'm seeing a lot of people who are from the climate change world trying to come up with ways to sort of get people still thinking about climate change amid this pandemic. Now, here's the thing I would ask: if you're going to be proactive as a journalist right now, we're approaching what is traditionally the hurricane season in North America, the cyclone season in the Pacific and Indian Ocean, and the great melt for the Arctic. And if it follows the trends of what we've seen in the last few years, the great melt this year will be worse than the prior year's great melt. And here's the question to ask yourself and to ask your local leaders. If on top of everything you're going through right now with COVID-19, a great storm hits, a great super tide rises, a great tornado strikes, do you have the capacity to respond? As we used to have in the old days of military thinking, the great phrase was, can we fight a two-front war? Right? And that was the idea that there were two giant wars going on at once. Did you have a big enough army capacity to fight a two-front war? I ask that now of public health. Could you right now, as emergency responders and public health leaders, fight a two-front war? If Texas slammed, or let's look at Louisiana, if New Orleans right now, which is getting hit so hard by COVID-19, if something even just half as horrible as Hurricane Katrina hit again, what would happen to Louisiana?
Hopefully people are asking those questions.
Yeah.
And again, thank you, Alexis. Thank you, Lori Garrett. Go to lorigarrett.com. Actually, Alexis, if you had one last quick thought, we could fit that into.
I just want to thank Lori. My students aren't journalism students, but they're very engaged and they're all over the country and all over the world. And you got our class off to a really provocative, powerful start. And, the toll this takes on journalists, I think, is a really important point to make. And I'm glad you get to go up to your roof every day and yell. And I just want to thank you. You've been on the forefront for as long as I can remember, and you've kept your spirit up and you've kept us informed, and you've been to some of the most dangerous spots on earth and come back to report about them with good cheer. And I know you're a bike rider. I hope you can bike again sometime soon.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm just going to close with a little bit of boilerplate, and also thanking the Earth Journalism Network, which helped to facilitate connecting a lot of journalists around the world with our discussion today. They're easy to find, just Googling. And I'm a big fan of Solutions Journalism Network, which is taking a solutions lens on this issue. What can we do as reporters to focus our capacities to build community capacity to get things better the next time? And Columbia Journalism Review has an ongoing covering COVID-19 Now initiative, along with their Covering Climate Now. Sustain What is a global conversation identifying solutions to the complicated, shape-shifting, and epic challenges of humanity's Anthropocene moment, whatever you want to call it. A prime focus is making sense of and getting the most out of the planet's fast-forward information environment. It's the one Earth system that's changing faster than the actual environment, and we're all amid it right now. That's the reason we can have this global conversation. It's also the reason a lot of misinformation can fly around. This is sponsored by Columbia University's Earth Institute, where I'm building a new initiative on communication and sustainability. Basically, how do you make information matter? That's what brings us all here, everyone here today. For the time being, these sessions will be focused on mitigating the unfolding societal disruption and devastation driven by the global spread of coronavirus disease 19, COVID-19. But we will dip into and dig deeper on other subjects and solutions when the time is right. So please stay tuned, follow, share, and do your little part to make communication matter wherever you are. So thank you very much. And Lori, big virtual hug to you for all you've done. And I'm glad to help you going forward in any way possible. And thank you, Alexis, for helping to wrangle some journalism students here too.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thank you all.
All right.
More soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.